I've often noticed the arrogance of unbelief, and it can be just as fierce and judgmental as the arrogance of belief. Now, some of you may be familiar with the new UU class. I don't know if Lower Bucks ever used that class, and I'm thinking about reviving it because it's a lot of fun. It's a 4-session introductory thing for newcomers, and we offered it twice a year at Bucksmont to help people learn more about UUism and about the congregation. And for the first session, you have everybody do a timeline of their religious journey. Give them a big sheet of newsprint, birth, where you are now, and you chart out the major things that have happened, the transitions, the shifts in your belief and understanding. I always took part in the exercise along with the class participants because I found it interesting to see what had changed for me. Each time I did it, different things would rise to the surface as being significant. Other things might slip away. But one thing that always appeared, and that I share now with some embarrassment, is a long period of my life that I call my time of dogmatic atheism. Now, I don't mean to imply that there's anything wrong with atheism. Atheism is a fairly common position in our congregations, and it's perfectly compatible with a deep and meaningful and compassionate life. When people ask me if I'm okay with atheists, I point out to them that my mother is an atheist, and I think she's the most wonderful woman in the world, and one of the most gentle and compassionate and thoughtful. But the atheism of my period of dogmatic atheism had no room for respect or tolerance. During that phase of my life, I was absolutely sure that not only did I not need faith, but that anyone who did have faith of any stripe was an idiot. And that was pretty much the language I would have used. That all religious beliefs were simply crutches for the maladjusted. And any whisper of faith or belief was enough to cause me to lose respect for the person in question and assume a tremendous moral and intellectual superiority. I had no meekness about my human mind and its limits. Gradually, however, I developed a deep respect for people of faith. This happened largely through my experience in divinity school, which I entered as an atheist and still a somewhat dogmatic one. But I encountered so many people in the ecumenical and multi-faith environment of seminary who were so remarkable, so intelligent and loving and compassionate and perceptive and faithful, that I had no choice but to change my perspective. But I kept my own identity as an atheist throughout most of that time, because to call myself an agnostic, even to call myself an agnostic, would have opened the door to things I simply found impossible. Because I was absolutely certain that God, as he had been defined for me by others, did not exist. And therefore I was an atheist. What happened then, though, was that gradually my understanding of what the word God could encompass began to change. And with that change, as I began to explore less traditional ways to think about God, then the agnostic position began to make much more sense to me. Now, God is a big subject. God would deserve a whole sermon series of its own. And it's not really the topic of this morning's service. But I need to say a few words about God in order to talk about uncertainty about God. When I say I'm an agnostic, I'm not talking about the literal God of the Bible as described in the Bible. God as Lord and Father, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-judging, ruler of heaven and earth, etc., still doesn't make sense to me. And if I went purely on that definition of God, I would still call myself an atheist, because that's not an understanding of God that resonates in my heart in a way that allows belief. But the word God can mean so many different things to so many different people. And I'm coming to love the word as a very convenient bit of shorthand to point to mystery. And I've decided that I don't have to let someone else's narrow definitions force me into a corner. Because the fact is that I no longer feel like an atheist. As my understanding of God has stretched and grown, it's becoming an idea that I can appreciate and wonder about. When I think about the love that flows between and among people, when I think about the mysterious sense of accompaniment that I sometimes feel during difficult times, that sense of not being alone in whatever I'm facing. When I feel a pull toward justice and compassion, and speaking or acting even when it might create difficulty for me. When I'm overwhelmed by a longing for something that is beyond my understanding. At those times, and at many others, I find myself confronted by a mystery for which I have no answers and no certainty, but for which I have a profound sense of wonder and gratitude. Not only am I unable to think it's nothing, and I should explain that when I first used this sermon, and I would have used the story again this morning, but we were welcoming new members instead of having a children's time, this wonderful little children's book called What Spot, where a penguin and a walrus, a puffin and a walrus, see a spot, and the one keeps insisting it's nothing, nothing at all, which of course turns out not to be the case. When I started feeling that sense of wonder and gratitude and mystery and belief, I kept insisting, oh, it's nothing at all. But in fact, eventually I wasn't able to think it was nothing anymore, and I stopped wanting to think it was nothing, because it feels like something real, something that I need in my life. Now, agnosticism, strictly speaking, works both ways. It asks us to allow doubt into our belief or into our unbelief. Whether we start from the assumption that there is a holy presence that we may or may not call God, or whether we start from the assumption that there is not, whether we start as a believer or as an atheist, agnosticism forces us to allow the possibility that we're wrong, that we can't know. Many people have a crisis of faith when their belief in God begins to feel threatened. I, having been raised in a humanist and atheist household, had my crisis of faith when my atheism began to feel threatened. I had my faith crisis in reverse. The crisis was that I began to have some faith, not that I lost it. That may sound absurd to some of you, but when you've lived your whole growing up life taking fierce pride in humanist Unitarian Universalism, and fiercely defending to more religious friends and acquaintances the right not to believe in anything, when you start thinking maybe you believe in something, it raises huge questions of identity. Now, for some reason in our Western culture, this idea of knowing, of being sure, has become enormously important. Religious knowledge, being